Inside ADX Florence, why solitary never ends. The place where silence becomes a sentence. There are prisons built to punish. There are prisons built to protect society. And then there are prisons built for a different purpose altogether. In the quiet desert of southern Colorado stands a facility so restrictive, so isolated, and so heavily controlled that many people believe it represents the final destination within the American prison system. A place where some of the most dangerous offenders in the country disappear from public view. A place where human contact is measured in minutes rather than hours. A place where silence can become a constant companion. Its official name is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. Most simply call it ADX Florence. To prison officials, it is a security solution. To critics, it is one of the most controversial correctional institutions in modern America. To the men who live there, it is a world unlike any other. For decades, stories have emerged from behind these walls. Stories of isolation. Stories of routine. Stories of inmates who spent years inside concrete cells with little direct human interaction. Stories so difficult to imagine that many people struggle to believe they exist in the 21st century. But ADX Florence is very real. And understanding this prison requires more than simply examining its walls. It requires understanding the philosophy behind it. Why was it built? Who ends up here? What happens to a person after years of extreme isolation? And perhaps the most important question of all, why does solitary confinement seem to never end? The answer begins long before the prison itself was constructed. It begins with a crisis that transformed the American federal prison system. A crisis that convinced authorities they needed something entirely different from any prison that had come before. What happened next would create one of the most secure prisons ever built. And as we'll soon discover, the conditions inside would make ADX Florence known around the world. Before we continue, subscribe for more prison and true crime documentaries, and leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. Why America built ADX Florence? To understand ADX Florence, it is necessary to travel back several decades. During the 1970s and 1980s, the American prison system faced challenges unlike anything correctional officials had previously experienced. Violent prison gangs were becoming increasingly organized. Some inmates continued directing criminal operations while incarcerated. Others assaulted correctional officers and fellow prisoners. Traditional maximum security facilities were struggling to contain a growing number of offenders considered exceptionally dangerous. The problem was not simply violence. The problem was influence. Certain inmates possessed the ability to organize attacks, intimidate witnesses, recruit gang members, and maintain criminal networks despite being locked behind bars. Even within prison walls, power still existed. And some prisoners knew how to use it. Federal authorities began searching for a new solution. Not a larger prison. Not a stronger prison. A different prison. A facility specifically designed for inmates considered too dangerous, too influential, or too difficult to manage within ordinary institutions. The concept was straightforward. If violence often depended on communication, movement, and access to other inmates, then reducing those opportunities might reduce the threat. Isolation became the foundation of the design. Separation became the strategy. Control became the objective. Construction eventually began near Florence, Colorado. The location itself seemed almost symbolic. Remote. Dry. Far from major population centers. The surrounding landscape stretched for miles beneath an enormous sky. At first glance, it hardly seemed like the location of one of the most feared prisons in the world. Yet beneath that peaceful appearance, something unprecedented was taking shape. Every hallway. Every door. Every camera. Every cell. Every procedure. Everything was designed around one central idea: preventing violence before it could happen. When ADX Florence officially opened in 1994, it represented a new era in American corrections. Officials believed they had created the most secure prison in the federal system. But over time, the prison would become known for something else. Not just security. Not just control. Isolation. Extreme isolation. And it is that isolation that continues to define the prison today. Entering the most secure prison in America. Imagine arriving at ADX Florence for the first time. The journey itself can feel surreal. The Colorado landscape appears open and empty. Mountains rise in the distance. The sky stretches endlessly overhead. Then the prison comes into view. Concrete. Steel. Security towers. Razor wire. Fence after fence after fence. The facility looks less like a traditional prison and more like a fortress designed for a modern age. Security begins long before an inmate reaches a housing unit. Every movement is controlled. Every transfer is documented. Every procedure follows strict protocol. The prison's architecture itself acts as a security system. Multiple layers of barriers separate inmates from the outside world. Electronic systems monitor activity. Surveillance cameras observe nearly every movement. Doors operate according to carefully coordinated procedures. Nothing happens by accident. Nothing is left to chance. The design reflects decades of lessons learned from prison violence, escape attempts, and security failures elsewhere. Correctional officials often describe ADX as a facility where security exists in layers. If one system fails, another remains. If one barrier is breached, additional barriers stand ready. The result is an environment unlike almost any other correctional institution in America. But despite all these visible security measures, the most significant feature of ADX Florence cannot be seen from outside. It exists inside the housing units, inside the cells, inside the daily routines. Because what truly separates ADX from other prisons is not the fences. It is the isolation. And once we step inside those cells, the reality becomes much harder to ignore. Life inside the cell. For most inmates housed under the prison's most restrictive conditions, life revolves around a single space. A cell measuring approximately 7 by 12 feet. At first glance, the room appears simple. Almost empty. But every element serves a purpose. The bed is often constructed from concrete. The desk is concrete. The stool is concrete. Fixtures are designed to limit opportunities for violence, destruction, or manipulation. There are no unnecessary features. No decorative elements. No sense of comfort. Everything reflects function. Everything reflects control. The narrow window has become one of the prison's most discussed features. Unlike ordinary windows, these openings are designed to limit what inmates can see. Depending on location, a prisoner may catch only a partial glimpse of the sky. The surrounding mountains that make Colorado famous are often hidden from view. The outside world becomes abstract, distant, almost unreal. For some inmates, this room becomes their entire universe. Not for days, not for weeks, but for years. Think about that for a moment. Every morning begins inside the same room. Every meal arrives inside the same room. Every evening ends inside the same room. The walls never change. The routine rarely changes. The environment remains remarkably constant. And over time, that constancy begins to shape the human experience itself. Some prisoners describe becoming intensely aware of tiny details. The sound of footsteps in a corridor. The hum of ventilation systems. Changes in light throughout the day. Small events that might seem insignificant elsewhere can take on enormous importance in a world defined by repetition. Yet this is only the beginning. Because understanding the cell means understanding the routine. And the routine is where the reality of life at ADX Florence truly reveals itself. A day that never changes. For most people, life is measured by variety. Different places. Different faces. Different conversations. Different experiences. Inside ADX Florence, life is measured differently. It is measured by routine. And over time, that routine becomes so predictable that entire weeks can seem identical. The day often begins before sunrise. Long before the Colorado desert begins to warm beneath the morning sun, activity starts inside the housing units. Lights illuminate the corridors. Security checks begin. Correctional officers move through carefully controlled procedures that have been repeated thousands of times before. For inmates, the morning starts in the same place it ended the night before. Inside the cell. Breakfast arrives through a slot in the steel door. The process is brief. Efficient. Minimal conversation. Minimal contact. The food tray slides through the opening. The door remains locked. The inmate remains inside. Then comes the long stretch of time that defines life at ADX. Hours spent alone. Hours that must somehow be filled. Hours that can feel ordinary one day and endless the next. For inmates who have spent years under these conditions, managing time becomes one of the most important survival skills. Without structure, days can begin to blend together. Morning becomes afternoon. Afternoon becomes evening. Weeks disappear. Months pass. Entire seasons come and go. Some prisoners respond by creating strict personal schedules. They wake at the same time every day. Exercise at specific hours. Read during designated periods. Write letters. Study books. Memorize information. Anything that creates order. Anything that gives purpose to time. Former inmates have described treating routine almost like a job. A way to maintain discipline. A way to preserve mental stability. A way to prevent the slow erosion that can come from endless repetition. Others struggle. Without meaningful social interaction, even simple tasks can begin to feel different. Conversations disappear. Group activities disappear. Many of the ordinary experiences that shape daily life outside prison simply do not exist. The hours stretch on. The silence returns. And eventually another meal arrives through the slot. Lunch. Then more time alone. Then dinner. Then evening. Then darkness. And the next day begins almost exactly the same way. For some inmates, this cycle lasts years. For others, it lasts far longer. What makes ADX unique is not just the restrictions. It is the consistency of those restrictions. The routine rarely breaks. The environment rarely changes. And over time, that unchanging reality becomes one of the prison's most powerful forces. Because when every day looks the same, time itself begins to feel different. And nowhere is that more visible than in the prison's approach to recreation. The recreation cages. Most people imagine prison recreation as a yard. A large open space filled with inmates. Basketball courts. Exercise equipment. Groups of prisoners talking beneath the sun. That image does not reflect the reality experienced by many inmates at ADX Florence. Here, recreation often means something very different. For prisoners housed under the most restrictive conditions, exercise frequently occurs alone. The recreation areas themselves have become famous. Or perhaps infamous. Former inmates have described them as resembling concrete cages. High walls surround the space. Security remains constant. Interaction remains limited. For a prisoner who has spent nearly an entire day inside a cell, recreation can become the only opportunity to experience fresh air directly. The only chance to feel sunlight without a window between themselves and the outside world. The only moment when the sky feels close enough to touch. And yet even this experience remains tightly controlled. Movement follows strict procedures. Escorts follow security protocols. Schedules are carefully managed. Everything reflects the same philosophy seen throughout the prison. Control. Separation. Prevention. To an outsider, 30 minutes or an hour outdoors may seem insignificant. To someone living in near constant isolation, it can become the most important part of the day. Former inmates have described counting the hours until recreation. Not because the space offered freedom. It did not. But because it offered something different. A change of environment. A break from the cell. A reminder that the world still existed beyond concrete walls. Some prisoners exercise intensely during recreation periods. Push-ups, sit-ups, walking in circles, running short laps. Anything to maintain physical fitness. Anything to combat inactivity. Anything to break the monotony. Others simply stand quietly beneath the sky, watching clouds move overhead, feeling wind against their face, experiencing sensations that many people take for granted. Small moments can become meaningful inside ADX. Because when life becomes highly restricted, even ordinary experiences gain extraordinary value. A glimpse of sunlight. A passing bird. A changing season. A distant mountain hidden beyond prison walls. These details may seem minor. But for someone spending years in isolation, they can become unforgettable. Yet even recreation cannot change a larger reality. Eventually the session ends. The escort returns. The cell door closes once again. And the silence returns with it. For some men, that silence becomes the greatest challenge of all. When silence starts to change the mind. Human beings are social creatures. Long before cities existed. Long before nations existed. People survived through interaction. Communication. Community. Connection. The human brain evolved in the presence of other people. Which raises a difficult question. What happens when those connections are removed for years at a time? The answer has become one of the most controversial aspects of ADX Florence. Supporters of the prison argue that isolation is necessary for certain inmates. These prisoners may have histories of violence. Histories of assault. Histories of organizing criminal activity behind bars. From this perspective, separation protects lives. It protects correctional staff. It protects other inmates. It protects the public. Critics acknowledge those concerns. But they point to another reality. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation. Mental health experts have spent decades studying the impact of solitary confinement. While experiences vary significantly between individuals, many studies suggest that long-term isolation can produce serious consequences. Anxiety, depression, difficulty concentrating, sleep disturbances, heightened stress. In some cases, more severe psychological symptoms. Former inmates have described feeling detached from reality. Others have spoken about losing their sense of time. Some became hyper-aware of tiny sounds. Others reported emotional numbness. The effects are not identical for everyone. Human beings respond differently to extreme environments. Yet few experts dispute that years of isolation can profoundly affect mental well-being. Imagine spending months with minimal conversation. Then imagine spending years. Now imagine spending decades. It becomes easier to understand why ADX remains the subject of ongoing debate. The prison is not controversial because people disagree about whether dangerous inmates exist. Most people agree they do. The controversy revolves around how society should manage those individuals. How much isolation is necessary? How much isolation becomes harmful? And where should the line be drawn? These questions have fueled legal battles, public criticism, and policy discussions for years. But inside the prison itself, the debate feels distant. Because regardless of public arguments, the daily reality continues. The door closes. The hours pass. And another day begins. The men sent here. ADX Florence was not designed for ordinary offenders. It was created for inmates whom federal authorities considered exceptionally dangerous or exceptionally difficult to manage. Over the years, some of the most notorious prisoners in America have spent time within these walls. Terrorism offenders, gang leaders, organized crime figures, escape risks, individuals whose actions transformed prison security policy. The names have changed over time. Some prisoners have been transferred. Others have died while incarcerated. Yet ADX has consistently housed individuals regarded as among the highest security risks in the federal system. For prison officials, this concentration of high-risk inmates helps explain why such restrictive measures exist. These are not prisoners selected randomly. Many arrived after lengthy histories of violence, disruption, or serious criminal activity. Some had already spent years inside other prisons before reaching ADX. Others were transferred after incidents involving staff assaults or institutional misconduct. The prison's mission has always been connected to containment. Not rehabilitation in the traditional sense. Not community interaction. Containment. Control. Security. That mission shapes everything. The architecture. The procedures. The routines. The restrictions. Every aspect of life inside the facility reflects the belief that certain inmates require extraordinary levels of supervision. But as we'll see later, that belief has not prevented controversy. In fact, some of the prison's most significant challenges emerged precisely because of the extraordinary measures used to achieve security. And those challenges would eventually lead to lawsuits, investigations, and national attention. Yet before we reach those controversies, we need to understand something else. How do people survive years under these conditions? How do they maintain hope? How do they maintain identity? How do they maintain sanity? Because for many inmates, survival inside ADX is not just physical. It is psychological. And the strategies they develop reveal a side of prison life rarely seen by the outside world. How inmates survive years of isolation. One of the most remarkable aspects of life inside ADX Florence is not the security. It is survival. Not survival in the traditional sense. Most inmates are not fighting daily battles for food or shelter. Instead, they are fighting a quieter battle. A battle against boredom. Against loneliness. Against hopelessness. Against the slow psychological pressure that comes from spending years inside an environment designed around isolation. For many prisoners, maintaining a routine becomes essential. Without structure, days can blend into one another until time itself begins to lose meaning. Some inmates become obsessive readers. A single book may be read multiple times. Others study history, law, religion, philosophy, or foreign languages. Many spend countless hours preparing legal appeals. Some write journals documenting every day of their confinement. Others create detailed exercise programs. Push-ups, sit-ups, squats. Hours of movement performed inside a concrete room. Not only to stay physically healthy, but to remain mentally focused. Former prisoners have described exercise as a lifeline. A daily reminder that they still controlled something. Even when nearly every other aspect of life was controlled by someone else. Letters from family can also become incredibly important. A single piece of mail may be read repeatedly. Photographs become treasured possessions. Memories become anchors to a world that feels increasingly distant. For inmates serving long sentences, maintaining a connection to that outside world can become one of the greatest challenges of all. Because the longer someone remains isolated, the easier it becomes to feel forgotten. And perhaps nothing is more dangerous to the human spirit than the belief that no one remembers you anymore. Yet despite these survival strategies, many prisoners continue struggling. Because eventually another reality emerges. A reality that has followed ADX Florence since its earliest years. The question of what prolonged isolation truly does to the human mind. The controversy that never went away. Over the years, ADX Florence has become one of the most debated prisons in America. Supporters and critics often agree on one thing. The inmates housed there are among the most dangerous in the federal system. Where they disagree is what should happen after those inmates arrive. Federal officials have consistently argued that ADX serves a critical purpose. The prison was designed to prevent violence, to protect correctional officers, to protect other inmates, to prevent organized criminal activity. And by many measures, the facility has succeeded in those goals. Violence inside ADX is generally far lower than in many traditional prisons. The environment is tightly controlled. Opportunities for assaults are greatly reduced. From a security perspective, the model appears effective. But critics argue that effectiveness comes at a cost. Mental health advocates, legal organizations, and former inmates have raised concerns for decades about the effects of prolonged solitary confinement. Several lawsuits challenged conditions within the prison. Some focused on mental health treatment. Others questioned whether certain inmates should remain under such restrictive conditions for extended periods. These legal battles drew national attention. They forced difficult conversations about punishment, security, and human rights. Can isolation remain humane when measured in years? What about decades? Should mentally ill prisoners be housed under such conditions? Can long-term solitary confinement ever be justified? There are no easy answers. And perhaps that is why the debate continues today. The issues surrounding ADX Florence exist in a gray area where security concerns and human consequences often collide. Neither side fully dismisses the other. Both acknowledge real risks. Both raise important questions. And those questions remain unresolved. Because ultimately, ADX Florence was built to solve a problem. But solving one problem sometimes creates another. Why solitary never seems to end? The title of this story asks a simple question. Why does solitary never end? The answer is more complicated than it first appears. Technically, many inmates are not intended to remain under the most restrictive conditions forever. The federal prison system includes classification reviews, behavior assessments, potential pathways toward less restrictive environments. On paper, progression is possible. Yet reality is often more complicated. Some prisoners arrive with lengthy histories of violence. Others maintain affiliations that create security concerns. Some commit disciplinary violations while incarcerated. Others struggle with mental health issues that complicate evaluations. Each factor can influence an inmate's status. Months become years. Years become decades. And before long, an inmate may have spent an astonishing portion of life inside a highly restrictive environment. For some prisoners, the challenge becomes psychological. How do you prove rehabilitation in a setting where meaningful social interaction barely exists? How do you demonstrate change when opportunities to demonstrate it are limited? These questions have fueled criticism for years. Yet prison officials maintain that security must remain the highest priority. And so the cycle continues. Review, assessment, classification, time, more time, and sometimes even more time. This is why ADX Florence remains so fascinating. Because beneath the concrete and steel lies a deeper story. A story about punishment. A story about safety. A story about what society chooses to do with the individuals it fears most. The final door. As night falls over the Colorado desert, ADX Florence becomes quiet. Not silent. There are still footsteps. Still radios. Still mechanical sounds from doors and security systems. But compared to the outside world, the difference is striking. Inside hundreds of cells, inmates settle into another evening. Some read. Some write. Some exercise. Some stare at concrete walls. Others simply wait. Wait for tomorrow. Wait for transfer reviews. Wait for court decisions. Wait for release dates that may still be decades away. And for a few, there may be no release date at all. The prison was built to contain those considered the greatest security risks in the federal system. It was designed to prevent violence, to eliminate opportunities, to maintain control. In many ways, it has accomplished those goals. Yet ADX Florence has also become something else. A symbol. A symbol of the ongoing struggle between security and humanity. Between punishment and rehabilitation. Between protection and isolation. The prison stands as a reminder that every correctional system eventually faces the same difficult question. What should happen to the people society fears most? There is no answer that satisfies everyone. There never has been. And perhaps there never will be. But behind the walls of ADX Florence, that question continues to play out every single day. One cell. One inmate. 1 year at a time. Because in America's most isolated prison, the sentence is not defined only by bars or fences. For many, it is defined by time. And by the silence that comes with it. ADX Florence remains one of the most secure and controversial prisons ever built. A place where safety, punishment, and isolation intersect in ways that continue to spark debate across America. Whether viewed as a necessary security measure or a symbol of the human cost of extreme confinement, one fact remains unchanged. Behind these walls, life unfolds far from public view. And for some inmates, the passage of time becomes the harshest reality of all. Thank you for watching. Until next time.